Good morning. So today I'm going to read Hal Draper's 1973 brief essay, Anatomy of the Micro-Sect, which is in many ways an extension and summary of the piece I read yesterday, the alternative to the Micro-Sect, from a few years prior, pardon me. 1970-71. As I didn't really provide much in the way of an introduction to Draper, and because he is such an important figure for me, I thought I would begin before going into that piece with a few prefatory pieces to set up Draper's career and the significance of these pieces within it, especially since I plan to read a few other late writings of Draper's on this platform, and because I'm also doing a series in which I read from his 5-volume magnum opus on Karl Marx's theory of revolution over on the Patreon account of this channel, which is patreon.com/socialistlegacy. You can get access to that by contributing as little as $1 a month. So if you're interested, please check that out. Okay, but without further ado, so this is an introduction to Hal Draper, written by his friend and collaborator Ernest Habakern in 1998. And this appears on Marxist.org on the Hal Draper Archive page. In the early years of this century, prior to World War I, there was in the United States a growing, vigorous, powerful socialist movement. In many respects, it was further advanced than the British socialist movement of the time. The usual indicator you run across in the history books is the presidential campaign of 1912, in which Eugene V. Debs gained some 6% of the vote as the candidate for the Socialist Party. But this statistic, in fact, underestimates the strength and significance of the movement. The socialist press, represented by dozens of newspapers and journals, had a wide circulation. Socialists were an open and well-organized force in the AFL, winning almost a third of the vote for their candidate in 1912. At the local and state levels, numerous socialists held office, and the party ran in a number of municipalities. Despite the wide-scale persecution that accompanied World War I, during the war, and in the early 20s, the American left experienced a new surge of growth and activity. While the Socialist Party split in the early 20s, the labor movement swung sharply to the left, and a serious attempt to build a new party based on the unions arose. Members of the Socialist Party and the new parties affiliated with the Communist International played important and influential roles in this revived labor movement. For a few years, during the late 20s, this revival appeared to falter. But the Depression and the collapse of confidence in the capitalist system, even among its beneficiaries, changed that. It was in 1932, in the midst of this widespread radicalization, that Hal Draper joined the socialist movement. Of course, as the son of immigrant garment workers, this formal act was not his real initiation into the world of the socialist and labor movements. From 1932 until his death in 1990, Hal Draper was a prolific Marxist writer and a socialist activist. He is one of the few people from that era who maintained and expanded this American socialist tradition, which has almost disappeared. World War II and the Cold War were a political space-time warp, and very few individuals or political tendencies passed through it intact. This is true of the socialist movement worldwide, of course, but the damage was greatest in the United States. Draper is one of the few who, instead of abandoning the movement in despair and rejecting his own political past, analyzed what was happening with the combination of rigorous research and passionate outrage that is the stamp of the Marxist tradition. In the 50s, a time of general collapse and demoralization in the American left, Draper edited the weekly Labor Action, a political journal widely read in Europe as well as the United States because of its uncompromising rejection of the American consensus, which did not depend on accepting that other form of despair, the slavish defense of really existing socialism as the only alternative. It was not possible, of course, to remain in opposition to the really existing crap of both sides of the Cold War without rethinking the history of the movement. Draper's 4-volume Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution is his principal achievement in this regard. Just a note, there was a 5th volume which Draper didn't complete before his death, but which was posthumously finished by one of his collaborators. The works collected here, namely, the works collected here, namely on the Hal Draper Internet Archive on Marxist.org, are manuscripts that were either not published or hard to obtain, and they emphasize sides of Draper's career and writing that are not included in Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution. It is a truism that the aim of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal was not to replace the capitalist system, but to save what could be saved from the wreckage of the Depression by making those concessions he had to, and using them to disarm and demoralize a potentially revolutionary movement from below. He succeeded admirably. Even today, when liberals and conservatives alike are dedicated to dismantling the welfare state he created, even Republicans pay tribute to this great president, and rightly so from their class standpoint. More important, however, than the immediate impact of Roosevelt's reforms in blunting popular discontent was the long-term benefit. Roosevelt's ersatz revolution destroyed the real socialist movement of opposition described above. Even historians and pundits who, usually approvingly, note Roosevelt's role in saving capitalism, pay little or no attention to the movement he was saving it from. Draper's essay on the student movement of the 30s is a good introduction to the real politics of this period, and in fact a good introduction to what Draper represented. Ernie Haverkern, 1998. Perhaps I'll get to that essay he mentions at the end at some point in the future, but I think just that little summary already touches upon what is so important about Draper to me if you've been following this project thus far. So, I'm also going to read another piece by Haberkern. This his obituary for his friend, for Draper, written right after his death, and published in Against the Current, a socialist journal, affiliated with Solidarity, which was one of the splinter sects that came out of Draper's work in the 60s and 70s with the independent socialist committees and the international socialist milieu. In Memoriam, Hal Draper. On January 26, 1990, Hal Draper, the leading international spokesman for the Third Camp Socialist position, and an active participant in and theoretician of the revolutionary socialist movement for over 50 years, died at the age of 75 in Berkeley, California. Draper first rose to prominence in the socialist movement in the 1930s. As national organizer of the Young People's Socialist League, he led the left wing of the student strike against the war, or the student strike against war. Draper outlined the history of the movement in his contribution to a collection of essays called As We Saw the 30s. Pardon me. The target of these student demonstrations, unprecedented in the United States, was not only, or even primarily, the impending war in Europe. It was not an isolationist movement mainly concerned with keeping the country out of foreign wars, as liberal historians continue to claim. The demonstrations were aimed at the chauvinism, incipient fascism, and increasing militarism, which were poisoning American political life as the Roosevelt administration prepared the American people for imperialist war. While the Communist Party and its liberal sympathizers swung from sectarian denunciations of Roosevelt as a fascist to the opposite extreme, denouncing Roosevelt's opponents and even tepid critics as the fascists, the left wing of the Socialist Party, especially the youth who were themselves prospective cannon fodder, became even more principled opponents of Roosevelt's foreign and domestic policy. It was in the student anti-war movement that Hal Draper met his future wife of 34 years, Anne Cratchit, I think that's how that's pronounced, who was also a prominent socialist activist and trade union militant. She died in early 1973. In 1934, the American supporters of Leon Trotsky, led by men like James P. Cannon, Max Shachtman, and Albert Goldman, the Socialist Party, seems to be some kind of typographical error, but I can't quite parse what it's meant to say, so pardon that. I think it's meant to say that they joined the Socialist Party in 1934, although I don't know if that's actually accurate. I think it was later. I think it was 36. I'm going to check that, actually. Okay, it did begin in 34. Okay, they left in 36. That's what I was thinking. Okay, pardon that. Okay, let me get back on track here. In 1934, the American supporters of Leon Trotsky, led by men like James P. Cannon, Max Shachtman, and Albert Goldman, joined the Socialist Party. They provided the left wing with an intellectual and political leadership it had lacked since the 1920s. Hal Draper became an active supporter and leader of the left wing that formed around these people. In 1938, in what Draper felt was a hasty and ill-advised move, Trotsky's supporters, in de facto collaboration with the right-wing leadership of the SP, split the party and formed their own organization, soon to be called the Socialist Workers' Party. Faced with the choice of supporting a revolutionary leadership he thought mistaken, and remaining with a party dominated by a right wing that was rapidly becoming an appendage to the Roosevelt wing of the Democratic Party, Hal Draper became a charter member of the Socialist Workers' Party. Before a year was up, the Hitler-Stalin Pact threw the Socialist Workers' Party, the labor and socialist movements, and the diplomatic and foreign policy of the major powers into a tailspin. Inside the Trotskyist movement and its periphery on the left of the socialist movement, the pact provoked a crisis. Already, in 1937, as Trotsky was preparing to found the Fourth International, there was growing opposition to support of the Soviet Union. Prominent spokesmen for this point of view, were James Burnham and Joseph Carter in the United States, and Ivan Crépeau in France. In response to the crisis of the Hitler-Stalin Pact, Joseph Carter took the position that Russia had become a new class society, neither socialist nor capitalist, which was an enemy of both the bourgeoisie and the working class. In the course of the discussions around this issue, Hal Draper became convinced by Carter's arguments. He drafted the 1941 resolution of the Carter position and based his political analysis of contemporary politics on that position for the rest of his life. Organizer and writer. As a member of the newly formed Workers' Party, formed from the 1940 split in the SWP, Draper spent the war years organizing opposition to the authoritarian and anti-labor policies of the wartime administration. He and his comrades agitated against the internment of Japanese Americans, the perpetuation and extension of Jim Crow legislation, and practice in the military and in civilian life, and the regimentation of labor through the no-strike pledge. Their newspaper and theoretical journal, Labor Action and the New International, detailed the reactionary policies of American and Russian imperialism as they maneuvered for position in the post-war world, cynically appealing to the horror and revulsion provoked by fascist and Nazi war crimes, while they assimilated the methods and techniques of fascism themselves. During this period, Hal and Ann Draper were employed in the shipyards in the Los Angeles area. They helped organize and lead the ultimately successful wildcat strikes that forced the union leadership, management, and the government to deal with the workers' trade union demands that had been sacrificed on the altar of the wartime emergency. In 1948, Hal Draper became editor of the theoretical journal New International. In 1949, he left that position to become editor of the paper Labor Action, which, under his editorship, changed from an agitational newspaper to one emphasizing socialist education and political analysis. In that same year, he authored the resolution on capitalism, Stalinism, and the struggle for the world, which used the position Carter had proposed in 1940 as the basis of a political perspective on the development of the post-war world. In this document, Draper applied the theory of bureaucratic collectivism, which is the name Carter gave to the new system, not only to Russia, its satellites, and China, but to the first glimmerings of non-Stalinist bureaucratic tendencies in capitalism and in liberal and social democratic ideology and practice. Throughout the 50s, Labor Action, published by the Independent Socialist League, as the Workers' Party was now called, remained a respected, knowledgeable, and principled opponent of American imperialism, as the authoritarian tendencies of the Roosevelt administration flowered in the Cold War period. In its reportage and analysis of McCarthyism, the American invasion of Korea, and the growing intervention in Vietnam, Labor Action, unlike many on the left, did not find it necessary to apologize for the Stalinist movements that so often benefited from American blunders and atrocities in this period. After the majority of the Independent Socialist League dissolved into the Socialist Party in 1958, a move Hal Draper opposed as an attempt to bury Third Camp socialism in a party moving in a pro-West direction, the Drapers spent a year traveling in Europe on a sort of political grand tour, meeting with leaders and activists of various tendencies in the socialist movement. They moved to Berkeley, California the next year, at a time when the student movement that was to give birth to the free speech movement and the new left of the 60s was already underway. Hal and Ann Draper were prominent advisors and leaders of the left wing of the Socialist Party in the early 60s, at a time when the party enjoyed an Indian summer of activity. Its members exercised considerable influence in the civil rights and peace movements. The SP enjoyed a brief monopoly position on the left, since the Communist Party and its periphery were in complete disarray following Khrushchev's revelations and the suppression of the rising of the Hungarian working class against Stalinism. A new movement. By 1964, the political and organizational ties of the right wing of the Socialist Party, under the leadership of Michael Harrington and Bayard Rustin, to the Democratic Party, had damaged the SP's reputation and strained its relations with the militants and even the not-so-militants in the civil rights and peace movements. The betrayal of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegation at the Democratic Convention of 1964 by these same leaders made continued membership in the same political party with them impossible for many socialists. In the early fall of 1964, the left wing of the SP in Berkeley constituted itself as the Independent Socialist Club, just in time for the free speech movement. It is difficult to imagine the outrage provoked by the free speech movement in these post-Vietnam War days. It should be pre-Vietnam War days. I'm not really sure. There's a lot of errors in this text, unfortunately. I'm surprised Against the Current allowed this kind of poor editorship on their website, but maybe I shouldn't be. Anyway. Not only conservative politicians and campus administrators, but prominent liberal politicians and columnists denounced the students, as did the student government and the student newspaper, the Daily Californian. I think maybe it means post-Vietnam War in the sense of after the beginning of the war, or after, but the war had been going on for some time at that point. Hadn't escalated yet, as it would soon, so. Okay, anyway, back on track. The only lib-lab type, liberal labor type, who backed the students was George Hardy of the Service Employees. He was the exception that proved the rule. His local had tried to organize dormitory workers on the campus the year before, and had been royally shafted by the liberal industrial relations expert who was the president of the university, a man named Clark Kerr. Hal Draper was one of the few from the generation of the 30s who spoke out in defense of the students. His pamphlet, The Mind of Clark Kerr, published by the Independent Socialist Club, articulated the students' deeply felt but unthought-out suspicions of this liberal administrator who was doing the dirty work of conservative opponents of civil rights. Draper's book, Berkeley, The New Student Revolt, published later that year, was the first serious attempt at a critical analysis of the New Left. Hal and Ann Draper continued to be active spokespersons for the left in the 1960s, especially in the growing anti-war movement in the unions. They were particularly active in the Labor Assembly for Peace. Ann Draper was one of the founders of this first organized attempt to swing labor away from the Meany line. As the New Left went into its precipitous decline in the late 60s, Hal Draper turned to the theoretical work which he felt was necessary to reorient an increasingly disoriented movement. His 4-volume study of Marx's political thought, Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, published by Monthly Review Press, has had an important impact on serious socialist scholars. In 1981, Hal Draper founded the Center for Socialist History, a non-profit organization dedicated to research and study on the origins and history of the socialist movement by and for socialists who want to understand their movement and its role in history and help shape its development in the future. Recent events in Eastern Europe, even more than the collapse of the New Left, demonstrate the need to rethink the socialist past as a prerequisite for and necessary part of effective revolutionary action. friends of Hal Draper suggest that memorial contributions be made to the Center for Socialist History. So that's his obituary for Hal Draper, Ernie Haberkern's obituary. And, you know, I think the Center for Socialist History project mentioned at the end there is, in my mind, it's a very direct inspiration for what I'm trying to do with the Socialist Legacy project. It's not, as far as I know, it didn't really develop into anything terribly substantial. It had publications that, it did produce, some publications that are probably worth looking into, some of which I have read. It does have a website currently, although it doesn't seem to be active, and I don't think it's been active for some time. But I am going to just read the brief description from that website of what is the Center for Socialist History, because it likewise, I think, captures something of the spirit of the project I'm trying to undertake here. So, what is the Center for Socialist History? The Center for Socialist History is a non-profit corporation founded to promote research and publication in the field of the history of socialism. We strongly believe that, to paraphrase, socialists who don't know their own history are doomed to repeat all the old mistakes. And the history of socialism shows that they do. The socialist movement is an amnesiac. Socialists know little about where they are coming from. No wonder they hardly know where they are going. The fact is that little work or publication goes on in the field by socialists. Most is by non-socialists or anti-socialists. They too can serve, but socialists' concern with their own history is not of an academic character. A living movement has to know the lessons of the past. There is a big gap that needs closing up, a vacuum that needs filling. We think this can and should be done on an all-inclusive basis, across the lines of schools, tendencies, sects, and viewpoints. Ideology and program are surely important, but it will not be the task of the Center for Socialist History to work them out or promote organizational forms. We simply think that people who know the socialist past will be better able to solve the problems of the present. Not to know what happened before one was born is always to remain a child. Cicero. History is philosophy teaching by examples. Dionysius of Halicarnassus. An historian is a prophet in retrospect. Schlegel. So that, I think, captures the spirit of this project. It also, to some extent, it also, I think, seems to me a kind of precursor of the Platypus Affiliated Society, which, as I've mentioned before, is an organization of which I'm a member and from which I received my education in Marxism, and which has a different orientation and different approach, but I think to addressing the same problem that is outlined there and that I'm trying to grapple with in a different way with this project, more oriented towards the contemporary left and attempting to use the history of the left to cast a light on it and its unfortunate condition and the problem infecting it. Whereas I'm more concerned with digging into the details of the history and bringing them to light in a kind of in isolation from the question of the contemporary left, and free from the distorting influence it can exert on this history when it's brought into the light of their concerns, which I think is a kind of distorting light. It's a light that is blocked and hence casts a shadow over some of what it tries to illuminate, or most of what it tries to illuminate. Okay, so without further ado, this is Hal Draper's 1973 essay, Anatomy of the Micro-Sect. The original subtitle of this document was a position paper. Sorry. The original subtitle of this document was a position paper by the Independent Socialist Committee. This was not a membership group, but an educational and publishing agency. In its original form, the first page bore a long footnote explaining the paper's use of the term sect. It is better presented here as an introduction to the essay. There is a terminological problem. Pardon me. There is a terminological problem. Sect is often used as a cuss word to mean a group one doesn't like. Movement is often used to describe something that does not exist in organized form, as when the American Socialist Movement is used as an abbreviation for scattered socialist elements that often do not move at all. We shall use these terms with more precise meanings. A sect presents itself as the embodiment of the socialist movement, though it is a membership organization whose boundary is set more or less rigidly by the points in its political program, rather than by its relation to the social struggle. In contrast, a working-class party is not simply an electoral organization, but rather, whether electorally engaged or not, an organization which really is the political arm of decisive sectors of the working class, which politically reflects or refracts the working class in motion as it is. A socialist movement sums up the mass manifestations of a socialist working class in various fields, not only the political, usually around a mass socialist party. For present purposes, the important distinction is between the sect form of organization and a form of organization common in other countries, but which does not yet exist in this backward country. This approach is basic to the paper, for essentially it deals with the question, is there an alternative to the sect mode of organization which dominates the whole history of American socialism, past and present? About the road to an American socialist movement. Since there are socialists in America, but no socialist movement, it is understandable that the socialists will say, let us go and form a socialist movement. All considerations argue for this obvious step, and there are no arguments against it, except one. This is the fact, historical fact, that no one can decide to make a revolution. Whatever is formed by fiat will turn out to be a sect alongside the other sects, even if it is that better kind of sect which believes in not being sectarian. Let us make clear from the outset that we do not have the answer to the $64 question, a formula or gimmick which, if only followed, will infallibly produce a party or movement out of the woodwork. We will all have to grope for some time. But we have some conceptions about the direction in which to grope, and the criteria for deciding whether developments are hopeful or hindering. Section 1. The Road Forward. A socialist movement will become a possibility in this country, as it did in others, as its bases are matured by social political conditions. If, however, it cannot be created simply by an effort of will, it is also historically true that it is not simply a matter of spontaneous generation. When the bases for a socialist movement mature, it will be difficult for it to come into being unless the nascent movement is crystallized with the help of active socialist elements. Every socialist movement has been the outcome of the fusion of spontaneity and leadership, of naturally developed elements and conscious organization. This means that for us American socialists today, who look forward to the building of a genuine socialist movement, there is a course we can take which will further this objective and bring it nearer, which will fructify the ground on which it will arise, and which will make it easier for its elements to mature from place to place. The alternative to creation by fiat is not that we passively wait for it to arise by itself without the intervention of human hands. It follows that the course taken now by American socialists can also have the opposite effect, of turning off dispositions toward a genuine movement, of sterilizing the ground on which the seeds of the movement might germinate, of making it harder for workers to find their way to a socialist movement in the making. Unfortunately, it is this latter course which today is dominant among the sects, sectlets, and micro-sects of what passes nowadays as American socialism. The sect form of American socialist groupment today is a roadblock in the way, and the sect notions that are dominant among this groupment constitute a poison which could immobilize and abort a socialist movement, even if it got started. Section 2, Fragmentation. American socialism today has hit a new low in terms of sect fragmentation. There are more sects going through their gyrations at this moment than have ever existed in all previous periods in this country taken together. And the fragments are still fissioning down to the submicroscopic level. Politically speaking, their average has dropped from the comic opera plane to the comic book grade. Where the esoteric sects, mainly Trotskyist splinters of the 1930s, tended toward a sort of super-sophistication in Marxism and futility in practice, there is a gaggle of grouplets now, mainly Maoist Castroite, characterized by amnesia regarding the Marxist tradition, ignorance of the socialist experience, and extreme primitivism. The road to an American socialist movement surely lies over the debris, or around the rotting offshoots of this fetid jungle of sects. To be sure, we recognize that there are sects and sects. We still have with us some sects and sectlets of the classic type, i.e., mainly feudal and fossilized, as distinct from the new crop of neo-Stalinist, Maoist, Castroite, etc., sects that represent a more positive danger to any healthy development in the working class movement. It is characteristic of the latter that they do not want a class movement, not because of some special organization conception, but because of their basic political conceptions. Just as their socialism is the rule of a state despotism over a bureaucratically collectivized economy, so their organizational road to power is the formation of an elite band of maximum leaders, which holds itself ready to bestow its own rule at a propitious moment on an elemental upsurge of the people. This is new only in the sense of being a regurgitation in new forms of the oldest type of leftist movement, the Jacobin putschist circles that dominated before the rise of Marxism. If these neo-Stalinist sects are oriented toward the working class, or toward the lumpen poor, or the blacks, or the third world, etc., it is only in the sense that men in a hurry orient toward a pack of horses. They make clear that the historical content of Maoism, in its different varieties, is the conception of the bureaucratic revolution from above, engineered by a band of self-appointed leaders riding on the back of a class movement, and bridling it, for which end the most suitable class is one with a minimum of capacity for initiative and self-organization, such as the peasantry. These elements are, some for reasons of class makeup, enemies to the revolutionary democracy of socialism. Hence also these elements need the sect form of organization. For them, the sect is not an unfortunate necessity due to the absence of a real movement. It is their movement. Minuscule size may not even be a drawback. For didn't Castro make the revolution with only umpteen good men? The answer, by the way, is no. The Cuban Revolution made Castro, not vice versa. But that is another story. How many commissars are needed on the long march? This, indeed, is part of the dynamic behind the current proliferation of sects, since they are not inhibited by the prejudice that a party needs much of a rank and file. It's not just Maoist, by the way, and a lot of the remaining kind of more hardcore Trotskyist sects take the same line, surprisingly. You think they would know better. Digression on my part. As for the section 3, the classic sect. As for the classic type of sects still operating, these presently divide more or less into those that stem from the Trotskyist sect tradition, and those that exemplify the social democratic pattern. To be sure, the Trotskyist grouplets shade off at one end into the neo-Stalinist type, particularly the larger sect called the Socialist Workers' Party, whose politics has steadily moved since Trotsky's death in the direction of Stalinization. What characterizes the classic sect was best defined by Marx himself. It counterposes its sect criterion of programmatic points against the real movement of the workers in the class struggle, which may not measure up to its high demands. The touchstone of support, the point d'honneur, in Marx's words, point d'honneur, sorry, I'm not great at French pronunciation, is conformity with the sect's current shibboleths, whatever they may be, including programmatic points good in themselves. The approach pointed by Marx was different. Without giving up or concealing one's own programmatic politics in the slightest degree, the real Marxist looks to the lines of struggle calculated to move decisive sectors of the class into action, into movement against the established powers of the system, state and bourgeoisie, and their agents, including their labor lieutenants inside the workers' movement. And for Marx, it is this reality of social class collision which will work to elevate the class's consciousness to the level of the socialist movement's program. To move a fighting sector of the class into action against the established powers by only a step is more important than 1,000 programs, Marx and Engels used to reiterate, and there's no use denouncing them for depreciating programmatic politics. To the sect mind, their approach is utterly incomprehensible. For over a century now, we have seen the two touchstones, and the difference is as glaring nowadays as it ever was. The most important test has always been the relationship of the self-styled Marxist and the working class organized on the elementary economic level, i.e., the trade union movement. The test is all the more decisive in the United States, where, unfortunately, the trade union movement is the only class movement of the workers in existence. Section 4. Sects and Trade Unions. The sect socialist, we use this awkward term instead of sectarian, which is usually understood to mean one who carries on certain policies. A term is needed for one who bases himself on sect organization, whatever the policies of the sect. The sect socialist has always felt a soul-torn difficulty in the face of a trade union movement which rejects socialism, and the dominance of sect life in the history of socialism has been accompanied by the predominance of a leftist hostility to trade unionism as such. Marx and Engels constituted the first socialist school to hold a position supporting trade unionism as such, while critical of given policies, leaders, etc., of course. And after their time, socialist history divides mainly between the social democratic types who supported reformist trade unionism precisely because they were themselves reformist rather than Marxist, and the would-be revolutionary socialists who found revolutionary arguments for returning to the old crap of socialist anti-trade unionism, with the addition of Marxistical rhetoric to dress up their sectist approach. Very few so-called or self-styled Marxists have understood the heart of Marx's approach to proletarian socialism. The basic strategy for building a socialist movement lies in fusing two movements: the class movement for this or that step, which gets a decisive sector of the class into collision with the established powers of state and bourgeoisie, a collision on whatever scale possible, and the work of permeating this class movement with educational propaganda for social revolution, which integrates the two. If this has been true in the best days of the Marxist movement to a greater or lesser extent, it took grotesque forms in the recent past of the American left, during the 60s, when the radical impulse was temporarily coming from non-worker sectors. Students and some blacks not rooted in working class life, for example. The student New Left commonly swallowed the image of labor dished out by the sociological brainwashers of the academy. Big labor alongside big business, etc. Identification of trade unionism with George Meany or Hoffa, implicit equation of the trade union movement with its bureaucracy, organized workers as an ipso facto middle-class stratum, and part of the establishment, and the rest of the ideological garbage from the real establishment's anti-working class mind mills. Even among those new left elements, the better ones, who oriented toward going to work in factories or plants, going to the people, the dominant conception was that trade unions, as such, had to be replaced with more radical formations of shop organization, which would somehow be outside the trade union structure, without being a dual trade union. These conceptions either remained in the realm of fantasy, while making it impossible for their holders to integrate themselves into the real movement as trade union militants, or worse, were acted out destructively in certain places, bringing harm to the workers and discreditment to the radicals. Nowhere did the New Left impulse into the factories eventuate in a more or less well-rooted movement of militants inside the trade union movement that could really offer opposition to the established bureaucracy. This is its indictment. The sectist approach to the class movement showed its pointed ears in many ways that need illustration. Here are two. Item. The student radical, heart filled with sympathy for poor workers, turns to the farm workers' struggle as one clearly meriting his support. Typically, he does not go to the people by going to work in the fields like other workers, for should his special talents be buried under a clod? He goes to work for the union, i.e., as what the union calls a student volunteer. Impressed by his own self-sacrifice on the one hand, and on the other he finds that the farm workers' union scarcely measures up to his ideal of what the class struggle should look like. Pretty soon he complains that the student volunteers have no say in policy, i.e., he demands that powers of decision be partly shifted out of the union members' hands and into those of the alien class visitors who have deigned to donate their time. Or, finding that the internal life and democracy of the union are far from satisfactory, he may decide that the farm workers do not really deserve his support. He would bestow his saving presence only on certified, pure class struggles, taking place on a different planetary plane. Item. The trade union movement was very behind-handed in producing opposition to the Vietnam War, as is well known, while anti-war feeling grew around the campuses. In student circles, the programmatic touchstone for complete opposition to the war came to be the slogan of unilateral withdrawal, which was richly justified. But finally, here and there pockets of anti-war opposition in the trade union movement did start developing. Eventually, a number of the more socially conscious and progressive labor leaders did screw up courage and founded the Labor Assembly for Peace in the teeth of violent denunciations by the meanie bureaucracy. These beginnings were timid in many respects, and among other hesitancies, stated opposition to the war without specifying the slogan of unilateral withdrawal. We know of no more flagrant example of the sect mentality than the scornful attitude taken by new leftists towards this beginning of an organized anti-war opposition in the labor movement. Even in the San Francisco Bay Area, which had the most militant and most wide-open branch of the Labor Assembly for Peace, and where leaders of the group, if not the group itself, openly spoke out for unilateral withdrawal, not one single new leftist eligible could be persuaded to taint his soul by having anything to do with a group so backward as to fall short of the unilateral withdrawal program. The fact that this development represented the first steps of a responsible sector of the trade unions moving into collision with the established powers, this fact meant nothing to the sectists. The only consideration they understood was their soul-saving shibboleth, which they counterposed to the real initiation of class motion. Section 5. The rut we are in. Such is the road of the sect. How do we get out of that rut? There are two notions that try to remedy the ills of sectism by broadening the sect. The intention is good, the remedy impractical. One is the proposal to abolish sectarianism by a call for the unity of all the sects. This may also be presented as a road to forming a socialist movement. It is a piteous illusion. In practice, it may mean a spate of unity negotiations among some of the sects, a common time-killing enterprise, or even a unification of two, a drop out of the bucket. But the actual unification of all the sects is an inherent impossibility where the programmatic shibboleths on which the sects are based are politically incompatible. The product of sect unification turns out to be nothing but a somewhat larger sect, as long as the conditions for a genuine socialist movement do not obtain. The idea of an all-inclusive sect is a will-o'-the-wisp. Incompatible political programs can be held together, at least for a historical period, within the framework of a party movement. For the cement which holds such a formation together is its role in the class struggle itself, the fact that it is the class in movement. What holds the antagonistic political tendencies in place is the pressure of the class enemies outside. As long as this is not the real situation of the movement, nothing else can take its place, including exhortations against sectarianism. The second proposal is one that aims at the same result by a different route, launching a sect whose distinguishing programmatic point is that it will voluntarily eschew distinguishing programmatic points. This is to be achieved by limiting the program to some minimum socialist or radical basis on which everyone can agree, i.e., a statement of abstract socialism. If a left wing wants to push the group to a revolutionary position, like no support to Democrats, the minimum is exploded. In practice, therefore, the program must be reformist. The Socialist Party has wanted to be this kind of sect for most of the time since it ceased to be a mass movement. And more recently, the New American Movement has set out to concretize this aim in some still unclear form. Sometimes the aim is derived by reminiscence from the different historical period before 1917, when the Socialist Party was a congeries of different political views which were not yet consciously understood to be basically antagonistic, and whose consequences had not yet been acted out. But we cannot simply pass a motion to go back to the Debs era. As long as the life of the organization, whether or not labeled party, is actually based on its politically distinctive ideas, rather than on the real social struggles in which it is engaged, it will not be possible to suppress the clash of programs requiring different actions in support of different forces. The key question becomes the achievement of a mass base, which is not just a numerical matter, but a matter of class representation. Given a mass base in the social struggle, the party does not necessarily have to suppress the internal play of political conflict, since the centrifugal force of political disagreements is counterbalanced by the centripetal pressure of the class struggle. Without a mass base, a sect that calls itself a party cannot suppress the divisive effect of fundamental differences on, for example, supporting or opposing capitalist parties at home, in the shape of liberal Democrats and such, or supporting or opposing the maneuvers of the communist world. Section 6. What then? If the road of the sect is a blind alley, what then? The road of the sect has always been a blind alley, yet socialist movements have come into existence. There has never been a single case of a sect which developed into or gave rise to a genuine socialist movement, by the only process that sects know, the process of accretion. The sect mentality typically sees the road ahead as one in which the sect, one's own sect, will grow and grow because it has the correct political program, until it becomes a large sect, then a still larger sect, eventually a small mass party, then larger, etc., until it becomes large and massy enough to impose itself as the party of the working class in fact. But in 200 years of socialist history, this has never actually happened, in spite of innumerable attempts. This is no proof that it will never happen in the unforeseeable future, but it is proof that there must be some other road to the formation of a genuine socialist movement, which is not the road of the sect. This road has been well-nigh totally forgotten in the general sectification of socialist circles in our period. The slightest acquaintance with Marx's view of what is to be done to build a socialist movement is enough to remind that Marx was violently and unconditionally hostile to anything resembling a sect. Not only did he never try to organize a Marxist sect, but he positively scorned those who did. It is less easily understood that Lenin never wanted to form a sect and never did so, and that the Bolshevik Party was not the result of a sect formation that grew by accretion. When Lenin came out of exile in 1900 and went abroad to begin the struggle to permeate the existing socialist circles with the ideas of revolutionary Marxism, he never thought to... Sorry, it's a typographical error, it's throwing me. He never thought to get up an ideological group, he never thought to set up an ideological groupment of his own. I'm going to restart that sentence. When Lenin came out of exile in 1900 and went abroad to begin the struggle to permeate the existing socialist circles with the ideas of revolutionary Marxism, he never thought to set up an ideological grouplet of his own, a sect, even though the Russian socialists in exile were already divided into sects, which were already splitting, etc. What Lenin helped to launch was a Marxist political center in a non-sect form, in the form of a periodical manned by an editorial board, Iskra. The political center itself educated for full revolutionary Marxism. At the same time, the party movement it called for was an all-inclusive socialist party in which the revolutionary Marxist center would constitute one tendency, hopefully eventually dominant. Both sides of the picture conditioned each other. Before we can unite, and in order that we may unite, we must first of all firmly and definitely draw the lines of demarcation between the various groups or tendencies, wrote Lenin on launching Iskra. But the lines of demarcation were not to be drawn along sect lines, with organizational walls bounding them. This was the sect course which he did not follow. Iskra was not merely a literary enterprise. This is a misunderstanding. A worker in Russia became an Iskraist insofar as he agreed with the political views of that political center, and as an Iskraist, he himself became a political center for further spreading those views in the popular circles in which he worked, in his factory, in his village, in his socialist circle. One of the views spread by this political center was that the party movement to be built should be a broad one. Lenin never gave up this conception of how to build a socialist movement at any time before the October Revolution. It was on the basis of this conception that the Leninist party actually evolved. We do not propose either the Russian movement or Lenin's course as the model for America in the 1970s. The significance of the case is different. On the other hand, it is many of the sects that believe they are following in Lenin's footsteps in building a hard sect on the basis of a shibboleth program. They are wrong because in this belief they have merely internalized what they have been told of the nature of Leninism by the anti-Bolshevik industry of the American establishment. On the other hand, the case of Lenin's road to a revolutionary party is important because he applied it uniquely. His unique course was to be serious and uncompromising about maintaining a revolutionary Marxist political center as the instrument of permeating the whole movement with its ideas, and insisting that majorities so gained be recognized by the whole movement. It was the right wing that split. We do maintain that the alternative to the sect road, which is suggested by the successes and failures of socialist history, is also suggested by generalizing from Lenin's Iskra model, as well as from a dozen other cases of the building of real socialist movements in various contexts and circumstances. Section 7. The Political Center. What should be done to prepare the ground for the eventual formation of a socialist movement party in America, that is, a mass-based socialist formation which is the political expression of the working class moving toward a collision with the established powers of capitalist society? We first address ourselves to the individual socialist, who wonders what he or she We first address ourselves to the individual socialist who wonders what he or she should and can do other than join the sect of his choice and waste his energies in the vicissitudes of sect life. You have the opportunity for undertaking a two-sided socialist enterprise, keyed to your own circumstances. We suggest the following double-barreled liaison for you, both sides of which are necessary for the whole thing to be meaningful. 1. Your basic contribution to the eventual formation of a socialist movement is what you do to develop a socialist circle around you where you are now. We are thinking in the first place of your role in the workplace, factory, office, school, or whatever. First things first, what the American working class movement needs, first of all, is the crystallization of an organized militant opposition in the trade unions, because this is the existing class movement of the workers, and the only one. It would be a sad sectarian mistake to think of this as a radical or socialist opposition, even though it will inevitably be powered mostly by radicals and socialists of sorts, and also inevitably lead its militants to think in radical and socialist terms. What is needed is a broad progressive wing of the labor movement. In Marxist terms, this is adequately defined as a wing which advocates class struggle unionism as against business unionism, whether it defines itself in class struggle language or not. From the point of view of the worker, there is a felt need to carry on a militant union fight without getting mixed up with socialism and Reds. From the point of view of the socialist, the organization of a militant opposition to the union establishment sets up an elementary school of class struggle socialism. One of its consequences, for example, is bound to be the politicization of the trade union movement, its entry into independent political action, which depends in turn on breaking up its attachment to Democratic Party politics. This opposition movement must be a loyal opposition. That means loyal to the interests of trade unionism in the same degree that it fights the boss and the bureaucrat, whose power is not in the interests of trade unionism. It is necessary to proclaim this today, to put it on the banner, so to speak, because the sect radicals have been so successful in discrediting themselves before conscientious trade unionists and confusing radical trade unionism with a sect's commando raids to rip off a plant situation by a display of militancy, even if the workers' interests are harmed or the union work is wrecked, as long as a couple of members are recruited to the sect. The sectists who operate in unions and plants to subordinate the workers' interests to their sect advertising adventures and sorties are enemies of the working class and of socialism, not merely misguided radicals who are to be chided in Marxistical editorials. They are not adventuristic allies of our camp in the class struggle. They are wreckers who cannot always be distinguished from police provocateurs. Any militant opposition movement in the trade unions which makes alliances with such elements will deserve its fate. If you are in regular contact with a number of people in the workplace or some other mass situation whom you are trying to influence in a socialist direction, then you are doing something. What the future socialist movement needs is a network of informal socialist circles, or formal ones, if you will, which have an integral relation to the real struggles people are carrying on. Instead of proliferation of sect-type groups, we should like to see a proliferation of open socialistic clubs, discussion circles, forums, and similar loose and unpretentious aggregations, which are formed around workplace situations by people engaged in common work. These would be among the nuclei around which a real socialist movement could crystallize, given favorable conditions. We freely recognize that favorable conditions do not obtain now, especially since the sectists would be eager to crush such hopeful developments in their lethal embrace. The same goes for the black movement, the women workers movement, the student movement, etc. You may be accustomed to the belief that only members of a sect are interested in such work. That is not so. There are innumerable cases where such cells of militancy have sprung up in workplace, office, or school around people who are not even socialists or do not know they are. What is true is that membership in a sect has often been the stimulus to undertaking this role through group pressure and guidance, and that the sect performs the service of providing reading and study materials, etc., for the circle activity. This does not point to the positive side of sect work, which we cannot deny. This does point to the positive side of sect work, which we cannot deny. What this means is that socialist efforts along these lines need the assistance of a political center of some sort, to which one can look for literature, advice, and help. Moreover, there soon arises the need for separate individual and circle efforts to be linked up. 2. But the role of a political center is not to be carried by a sect. Historically, this job has been done most often and most successfully by a paper or other publication of a socialist political center, which is organized simply as an editorial board or other editorial enterprise. Iskra was only one of dozens of examples of how this was done as socialist movements came into existence all over the world. Historically, also, political centers of this sort have frequently undertaken organizing functions as their influence spread, the organizing being the product or byproduct of the work of its agents and representatives. Iskra agents were the organizing arms of the first Leninist center. The point would be utterly lost if these enterprises were to be considered merely literary enterprises in the usual bourgeois sense. There is a continuous line which has carried such political centers from their functions as producers of literature to their role as centers for the stimulation of organization in one form or another. Such political centers are operating today in this country alongside the proliferating sects, and often quite effectively. Naturally, it is a question of political centers with widely varying political complexions, most of them distasteful to our own views and to each other's. We mention them not to celebrate their work, but to exhibit alternatives to the sect road. The Guardian and Sweezy's Monthly Review have functioned more or less as political centers emerging from a neo-Stalinist tendency of one kind or another. Indeed, The Guardian is now involved with a brace of neo-Stalinist sects in talking up the formation of a Maoist party out of their unification. On the right-wing, social democratic side, the clique of littérateurs around dissent functions as the only political center for that tendency that exists outside of George Meany's offices. These examples differ in the amount of attention they pay, or have paid at other times, to the functioning of relating to their readers, or followers, in the field. For our present purposes, we wish only to stress that a political center does not have to be a sect. More, a political center can undertake a relationship with its followers which is not bedeviled by the rigid requirements of organizational life, its life and death votes, faction fights, splits, internal disputes, and ingrown rituals of imitating a miniature or micro-mass party. From the point of view of the individual socialist who wants to do something, we would summarize our suggestion as follows. 1. Crystallize a circle of co-thinkers around you, wherever you are, in the course of your activity in the arena of the social struggle that goes along with your situation. You are the smallest unit, political center, there is. 2. Make contact with a political center that makes sense from your own point of view, for help in literature, advice, and outside link-ups, and work with it to whatever extent you find useful. But there is no reason against having this relationship with more than one political center, if they suit your own political views. Such a political center may even be a sect. But if you do not join it, it relates to you only as one political center among others. This relationship is a hang-loose relationship. If you do not have a vote in deciding its affairs, it is likewise true that it cannot tell you what to do by exerting its sex discipline over your own judgment. You do not erect an organizational barrier between you as the adherent of one sect and someone else who cleaves to another one or none. In your work, you use whatever literature you wish, whatever their source. You will use your money not for the sect's fund drives, but to finance your own work. If enough take this course to break up the sect system, that would be a good thing for the future potentialities of an American socialist movement. There is a better chance of a genuine socialist movement arising out of such a hang-loose complex of relationships than out of the fossilized world of the sects. We are not under the impression that a very large number of individuals are going to start tomorrow by following the course we have described above. We have been interested so far simply in illustrating the way in which socialist movements have arisen elsewhere, the only way, in broad outline. We have sketched the kind of development which provides an alternative to the sect mode of organization, which is driving American socialism into the ground. Very likely, whatever will happen in this country will happen somewhat differently, as usual. If the springing up of socialist circles is not happening on a mass scale, it is also true that there is no other direction visible in which the emergence of a mass socialist movement is just around the corner. All one can do is push in a direction in which one's efforts will not be wasted, no matter what the outcome. The only thing we are sure of is that the road of the sect is a dead end. The Independent Socialist Committee is itself an effort to establish a political center The Independent Socialist Committee is itself an effort to establish a political center for our current of revolutionary Marxism. The view that the workers of all countries constitute the class base of a third camp, which must fight and destroy both the capitalist system and communist bureaucratic collectivism, if the revolutionary democracy of a socialist world is to be established. It begins as an editorial board for the production of books and pamphlets, not yet a periodical, embodying the case for this world outlook. In this way, we are exemplifying our own advice. October 1973. So that is the anatomy of the Micro-Sect, and I want to reflect on what I just read and how it relates to this project, but I'm actually running a little late now, so I'm going to have to conclude this video here. But hopefully tomorrow I'll come back and give some thoughts on the two Draper pieces on the Micro-Sect and how they relate to what I'm trying to do here with the Socialist Legacy Project. So thank you for watching or listening, and have a good day.